Welcome, everyone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something really fascinating, the money behind a major political battle.
That's right. We're looking at the 2016 Democratic presidential primary, Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders.
And we've got this great report breaking down the financial side of things. So our mission today.
Basically, to unpack how they funded their campaigns, how different their strategies really were, and then tackle that big question. Did the money ultimately decide who won the nomination?
It's such a compelling contest to look at through this lens because it wasn't just policy differences, right? It was almost like two completely different ideas about how you even fund a campaign clashing head on.
Exactly. We're talking huge sums of money, totally contrasting ways of raising it.
Yeah.
And it all feeds into that perennial debate, how much does cash really matter in politics today?
Right, let's jump in.
Okay, so first let's set the scene a bit. The 2016 election cycle, it was just swimming in money. Billions across the board.
Billions. And a lot of that flowing through those outside groups, the super PACs.
Precisely. The whole landscape had been reshaped, really, by the Citizens United Supreme Court decision a few years earlier. That opened the floodgates for unlimited spending by these independent groups.
Yeah, that ruling always seems to hang over these discussions. So, given that environment, this big money reality, what's the core question for us today about Clinton and Sanders specifically?
Well, it boils down to how did their campaign finances stack up against each other? And what can we learn from looking at those numbers, those financial footprints?
Okay, let's start with the top line figures, the official campaign committees. How did they compare?
So the report shows Hillary Clinton's official campaign committee, Hillary for America, pulled in a really substantial amount, $563.7 million.
Okay, $563.7 million. And Sanders?
Bernie Sanders committee, Bernie 2016, raised $228.1 million. Now, that's a huge amount, especially for, an insurgent campaign. But still, you see a significant gap right there.
More than double. But that's just the official campaigns, right? What about the outside money, the super PACs and other groups?
Ah, yes. And this is where the difference becomes, stark. Groups supporting Clinton raised an additional, quite staggering, $206.1 million.
Wow. $206 million on top of the campaign funds. And for Sanders?
Much, much less. The summary data points to about $934,993 for specifically pro-Sanders outside groups.
Less than $1 million compared to over $200 million.
Right. Now, we should add a little nuance there. The National Nurses United Super PAC, which backed Sanders, they reportedly spent around $4.6 million. So the spending might be a bit higher than that initial fundraising summary figure suggests for outside help.
Yet still, the difference is enormous.
It's massive. So if you combine the campaign funds and the outside group money, you're looking at Clinton having access to almost $770 million.
$770 million.
And Sanders combining his campaign and that outside support around $229 million.
So the overall gap is roughly, 3.5 to 1?
Yeah, about that. $3.5 for Clinton for every dollar Sanders had. That's a huge difference in resources for everything: ads, staff, travel, organizing.
What drove that massive difference? Why such disparity?
Well, it really reflects their places in the party. Clinton was the established figure, former Secretary of State, Senator First Lady. She had deep, long-standing connections to the traditional Democratic fundraising network. Big donors, party figures, major unions.
An existing infrastructure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Built over decades, really.
Yeah.
Sanders, on the other hand, was running as the outsider, explicitly challenging that establishment. His whole campaign was built on grassroots energy.
And his fundraising reflected that, presumably?
Completely. Of a bottom-up model,
Oh.
as we'll see when we dig into the donor basis.
Okay, let's do that. Let's look inside the campaign committee money. Where did it come from? Talk about Clinton's donor profile first.
Sure. For Clinton's campaign committee, the main source was large individual contributions, those donations of $200 or more.
Okay.
That accounted for nearly 53% of her direct campaign funds, over $300 million just from those larger checks.
And the small donors, under $200.
Much smaller share for her, about 18.6%, roughly $105 million. There was also this kind of significant other category, around 28%, which can include things like transfers, maybe smaller or unitemized amounts.
So primarily fueled by donors giving larger amounts. Any self-funding?
Negligible, almost none.
And which industries or sectors were heavily represented among her donors, if we look at both the campaign and the outside groups backing her?
Yeah, combining both, the big players were securities and investment Wall Street, essentially. Then retired individuals, lawyers and law firms, education, and the entertainment industry, TV, movies, music.
Interesting mix. What if we just look at the campaign committee donors? Any difference?
A little shift in emphasis. Retired individuals were top. then lawyers, law firms, education, and then specifically groups focused on women's issues and health professionals were prominent direct contributors to the campaign.
Can you give some examples of the major contributors, maybe names or organizations that stand out in the report across both campaign and super PACs?
Sure. The report lists quite a few, especially for the super PACs. You see major financial firms or figures associated with them like Paloma Partners,
Yeah.
Renaissance Technologies, Lone Pine Capital.
Big finance names.
Yes. And wealthy individuals and foundations folks like the Pritzkers, George Soros's fund, Haim Saban, and also big labor unions were key, particularly carpenters, laborers, plumbers, pipe fitters, the AFT Teachers Union. A lot of those large union contributions went to the super PACs.
And this all fed into her fundraising strategy.
Absolutely. Clinton's approach relied heavily on those high-dollar fundraising events, dinners, receptions, tapping into that established network of wealthy donors who could write large checks, often directly to the campaign or that joint fund we might discuss later, or to the super PACs.
Right, the traditional fundraising circuit. Now let's pivot to Sanders. You said it was a completely different story. How so?
Oh, totally different. Chalk and cheese, really.
Yeah.
Sanders' campaign committee, overwhelmingly funded by small individual contributions, those under $200.
That was his big talking point, wasn't it?
It was central to his message. And the numbers back it up. Small donors accounted for about 57.7% of his direct campaign funds. That's over $134 million from small checks.
And other reports maybe put that percentage even higher.
Yeah, some analyses looking over slightly different time frames or methodologies suggest it might have been closer to 62%, maybe even higher if you look purely at itemized versus unitemized. But the main point holds. Small donors were the engine.
What about large individual donors for him, the $200 plus category?
That's about 41.6% for Sanders. So still significant, nearly $97 million, but just proportionally much less dominant than for Clinton. And very little in that other category, and no self-funding to speak of.
And he made a big deal about rejecting corporate tape money. Did that hold true for his committee?
It did. The report shows his campaign committee, Bernie 2016, received a tiny amount from PACs, something like $5,600 in total, essentially zero compared to the overall scale. That was a core principle for him.
So if not finance or big corporate PACs, who are the main backers reflected in Sanders' donor lists? Which industries?
It reflects that grassroots base. Retired individuals, again, they give across the spectrum. But then education professionals were huge for him. Democratic and liberal activists, health professionals, civil servants, and public officials.
And the list of top contributors mentioned in the report, it looks different too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because he didn't take big organizational checks, the list often reflects the employers of his many individual donors. So you see places like Alphabet, Google, the University of California system, Microsoft, the U.S. Postal Service, Apple Inc.
So people working at those places giving individually.
Exactly. It shows the breadth of his support across different sectors, but through individual contributions, not institutional ones. It's a stark contrast to Clinton's list, heavy, with finance firms and big unions giving directly or to PACs.
It really paints a picture. Clinton, high-dollar events, established networks. Sanders, online appeals, mass mobilization of small donors.
Precisely. Sanders harnessed the power of the internet and platforms like ActBlue. His campaign constantly highlighted that famous average donation figure around $27.
Right, I remember that number everywhere.
It became a symbol of his campaign's identity. Funded by the people, not by special interests. He actively shunned those exclusive high-ticket fundraisers that were Clinton's bread and butter.
So comparing those donor bases directly small versus large percentages for each, what's the big takeaway?
The takeaway is just how fundamentally different their funding models were. Clinton, primarily large donors. Sanders, overwhelmingly small donors. And this wasn't just like a tactical choice. It really mirrored the ideological split in the party at that moment.
How so?
Well, Clinton represented the more traditional wing, comfortable working within the existing, often big money system. Sanders represented a challenge to that system itself. His fundraising success, particularly with small online donations, was genuinely groundbreaking. It showed you could raise serious money differently, challenging the conventional wisdom.
A proof of concept for grassroots funding on a massive scale.
Definitely. It energized a lot of people.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and talk more about that outside money, the PFREs and super PACs. We know Clinton had a huge advantage there overall. Who were the main groups on her side?
Yeah, she had a very well-funded ecosystem supporting her. The giant in the room was Priorities USA Action. That one super PAC raised a massive $192 million just on its own.
192 million from one group. Wow.
Incredible, isn't it? Then you had other significant ones like Correct the Record, Ready PAC, and some smaller ones too, all adding up to that $206 million total for outside support.
And these groups can raise unlimited amounts, right? As long as they don't directly coordinate with the campaign.
That's the rule, post-Citizens United. Unlimited funds from corporations, unions, wealthy individuals.
And where did Priorities USA and the others get that kind of cash? We touched on it, but who were the mega donors?
It came from a relatively small number of very, very wealthy donors and institutions writing multi-million-dollar checks. People like George Soros, James Simons from Renaissance Technologies, Haim and Cheryl Sabin, members of the Pritzker family.
Big names, big money.
And major labor unions, too, especially building trades, SEIU, AFT. They put significant money into these supporting super PACs. The top industries feeding these PACs were, again, finance, building trade, and entertainment.
So what was the point of these super PACs strategically? What did they do for the Clinton campaign?
They essentially ran a parallel campaign effort. Priorities USA, for example, spent heavily on advertising TV, radio, digital ads. They did direct mail, opposition research, basically blanketing the airwaves and mailboxes.
And that frees up the official campaign to do other things.
Exactly. The official campaign could maybe focus more resources on field organizing, get out the vote efforts, or perhaps maintaining a slightly more positive message profile, while the super PAC could handle some of the more aggressive advertising or attack lines.
It gives strategic flexibility. Now, the report also mentions something called the Hillary Victory Fund. What was that, and why was it controversial?
Yes, the Hillary Victory Fund. That was a JFC, a joint fundraising committee. It involved Clinton's campaign, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and dozens of state Democratic parties.
Okay, sounds complex.
It was. And the controversy stemmed from its structure. It allowed very wealthy donors to contribute huge sums, way more than they could give directly to the Clinton campaign alone, with the idea being the money would be shared between the campaign, the DNC, and the state parties.
But did it work out that way?
Well, critics, especially from the Sanders camp, alleged that the way the money flowed, it disproportionately benefited the Clinton campaign first, before trickling down, if at all, to the state parties. They argued it was essentially a way to bypass individual contribution limits for her campaign and, perhaps more contentiously, suggested it compromised the DNC's neutrality during the primary.
Yeah, that definitely adds another layer to the finance picture. Okay, back to Sanders. We know his outside support was minimal in comparison. What more can we say about it?
Well, the main player identified was the National Nurses United for Action Super PAC. As we said, while the overall raised amount for pro-Sanders groups in some summaries looks tiny, NNU reportedly spent around $4.6 million on things like ads and voter contact supporting him.
So not nothing, but still dwarfed by Clinton's outside support.
Absolutely. There were a few other much smaller groups like Progressive Kick or Feel Burn, but their financial footprint was minimal. And of course, Sanders himself consistently denounced the whole concept of super PACs.
So what did that lack of major outside backing mean for him strategically?
It put him at a significant disadvantage, no question, especially in paid media. Clinton and her allies could just flood the zone with advertising in key states in a way Sanders simply couldn't match with independent support. His campaign's own money had to stretch much further to cover everything.
He couldn't rely on that parallel air war being fought for him?
Exactly. It's also kind of a quirky side note. The report mentions some conservative super PACs actually spent money attacking Clinton in ways that might have indirectly boosted Sanders among some primary voters, but that's a much harder effect to quantify.
Interesting dynamic. So looking at that outside money comparison again, Priorities USA versus NNU and the others.
It just hammers home the scale of the imbalance. It was arguably Clinton's single biggest financial weapon, that massive super PAC advantage. It really showed the power of combining a strong traditional campaign with the unlimited firepower of outside groups in this era.
Okay. All this money raised. It had to be spent. Let's talk expenditures. How did the spending totals compare?
Right. Unsurprisingly, the spending mirrors the fundraising gap. Clinton's official campaign committee spent about $563.4 million.
Pretty much all it raised.
Yeah. Sanders' committee spent about $222.7 million.
Yeah.
Again, close to what it brought in.
And when you add the outside group spending supporting each candidate,
Clinton's total support spending climbs to roughly $768.6 million. Sanders' total support spending, including his campaign and that outside bit, lands around $223.9 million.
So that 3.5 to 1 ratio holds pretty steady on the spending side, too. Where did all that money go? What were the main spending categories for Clinton?
For Clinton, the absolute biggest chunk was media. Over $350 million just on media,
Hmm.
buys TV, radio, digital ads.
Wow, that's a huge amount just on ads.
It really is.
Yeah.
After that, other major costs were salaries for her large campaign staff, administrative costs, rent, supplies, etc., and fundraising costs, paying for those high-dollar events.
And her top vendors reflect that.
Yeah, the list is dominated by big media buying firms like GMMB, digital consultants like Bully Pulpit Interactive, payroll companies like ADP, production companies. It screams traditional, large-scale, media-heavy campaign.
Makes sense. What about Sanders' spending breakdown? Was media also his biggest cost?
It was his largest single category, yes, at about $118.4 million. But proportionally, it was a smaller slice of his total budget compared to Clinton's media spending.
So where else did his money go?
Well, interestingly, there's a large unclassifiable category in the data for him. But beyond that, significant spending went to salaries, administrative costs, and general campaign expenses like travel and events. Crucially, though, his vendor list highlights the importance of digital.
How so?
You see Old Town Media for media buying, but also Revolution Messaging, his key digital and online fundraising firm. Tiger Eye Designs for merchandise, which was a big grassroots tool for him, and Act Blue, the donation platform itself, shows up as a major vendor because they process the donations and take a small fee. Air charter services, polling farms.
Yeah.
It reflects a campaign needing media, but also heavily reliant on digital tools and grassroots mobilization.
So Clinton's spending looks very much like a traditional top-down media-focused campaign machine. Sanders looks maybe a bit more hybrid, still needing media, but with a huge emphasis on the digital and online fundraising side.
That seems like a fair characterization. Clinton's sheer spending advantage obviously bought her a massive media footprint. But Sanders' investment in digital wasn't just for ads. It was the engine of his fundraising, and to a large extent, his volunteer organizing too.
And did spending more always translate to winning? What did the report say about spending effectiveness, maybe in specific states?
It gets complicated there. Sometimes Sanders' campaign might have actually outspent Clinton's campaign directly in the final weeks before a primary in a given state. But then you have to layer Clinton's super PAC spending on top of that, which often tipped the scales back heavily.
Right.
And the report touches on cost per vote estimates. Sometimes the candidate who spent more per vote actually lost the state or won by a smaller margin than expected. It suggests, diminishing returns. Throwing more money at a race doesn't automatically guarantee success, especially if the message isn't connecting or the opponent has strong grassroots energy.
A good reminder that voters aren't just passive recipients of ads. Okay, this brings us to the core question we wanted to tackle. Based on everything we've discussed, the massive financial gap, the different models, the spending, can we say Clinton's financial advantage won her the nomination?
Well, one is a strong word. It's probably too simplistic. But was it a major factor? Absolutely. You have to start by acknowledging that 3.5 to 1 overall financial advantage, and particularly the outside money difference. That's just a huge structural advantage.
So what's the case for money being a decisive or at least hugely significant factor?
There are several points. First, advertising saturation. Having that much more money just lets you dominate the airwaves, shape the narrative, respond instantly to attacks, especially over a long primary season across dozens of states.
Endurance, almost.
Exactly. Second, organizational scale. More money generally means more staff, more field offices, a bigger get-out-the-vote operation. In a primary fought state by state for delegates, that ground game matters. Clinton's resources allowed for a larger, more traditional organization.
And the super PAC.
That's the third point. The strategic flexibility they offered. They could run negative ads, do opposition research, allowing the main campaign to stay more positive. They provided an independent layer of attack and defense that Sanders largely lacked.
And maybe a fourth point about momentum.
Yeah, arguably. Early fundraising success, especially among big donors and establishment figures, signals viability. It can create a sense of inevitability, attract endorsements, and build momentum that's hard for a challenger to break. Clinton's early financial strength certainly helped consolidate establishment support.
Okay, that's a strong case for why the money mattered a lot. But you said it's more nuanced. What are the counter-arguments or the factors that push back against the idea that money was everything?
Well, first and foremost, Sanders' own fundraising success. He proved you could raise truly competitive amounts of money, over $200 million, primarily from small donors. That was unprecedented and showed a different path was possible. And that grassroots funding came with incredible volunteer enthusiasm.
The energy factor.
Right. There were even times, specific months, when Sanders actually outraised Clinton's campaign committee. Second, message resonance. Sanders' message clearly struck a chord with a very significant part of the Democratic electorate. Money helps amplify a message, but the message itself has to connect. And as we noted, spending more doesn't always mean spending effectively.
Diminishing returns again.
Exactly. Third, earned media. Especially early on, Sanders got quite a bit of positive media coverage simply because his campaign was novel and gaining traction. Now, comparing earned media in 2016 is tough because Trump dominated everything. But it was a factor.
Great exposure.
Yep. And fourth, you just can't ignore non-financial factors. Voter priorities, the economy, healthcare, ideology, policy differences between the candidates, candidate perceptions, likability, trust, maybe lingering dissatisfaction with Clinton among some parts of the party from previous runs. These all played a role independent of the bank accounts.
And briefly, the report might allude to institutional dynamics, like
Right.
the DNC role.
Yes. Without getting too deep into the weeds, there were those allegations we touched on regarding the Hillary Victory Fund and perceptions of DNC bias, which some Sanders supporters felt tilted the playing field institutionally, regardless of the finances.
Okay, so weighing all the clear financial advantage versus the power of Sanders' grassroots movement and message, what's the final synthesis? How much did the money matter?
I think the most balanced conclusion is that Clinton's financial advantage was a significant, probably crucial contributing factor to her nomination victory. It wasn't the only reason she won, but it provided enormous sustained advantages over a long and grueling primary campaign.
So important, but not solely decisive.
Right. Sanders showed that grassroots funding could mount a formidable challenge. But the sheer weight of Clinton's resources, the ability to consistently outspend on ads, maintain that larger infrastructure, benefit from that massive super PAC shield and sword, likely made the difference in grinding out delegate wins across many states. It's the combination, the synergy of money with establishment backing and a pre-existing network that proved so powerful.
It really highlights that clash of models.
It does. It showed the incredible potential of online small-dollar fundraising, but also underscored the persistent advantages of the traditional big money approach, especially when amplified by super PACs in the current legal environment. It left big questions, really, about the future of campaign finance.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways we should leave our listeners with regarding the money in that 2016 primary?
I'd say three main things. One, the stark, almost ideological contrast in fundraising models between Clinton's establishment large donor approach and Sanders' revolutionary small donor grassroots machine.
Right, the two philosophies.
Two, the sheer scale of the financial disparity that's created, especially when you factor in the massive advantage Clinton had in outside money from super PACs, that 3.5 to 1 gap is hard to ignore.
The raw numbers.
And three, the nuanced conclusion about impact. While Sanders proved grassroots funding could fuel a major challenge, Clinton's ultimate victory suggests that in a long state-by-state primary fight, the advantages conferred by deep financial resources, traditional networks, and super PACE support remain incredibly potent, even if not solely determinant.
It really sets the stage for ongoing debates, doesn't it? It makes you wonder how these dynamics, the grassroots versus the big money, the role of super PACs will continue to play out in future elections, and the whole discussion around campaign finance reform, something definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. A fascinating case study.
Thanks for walking us through it. Really insightful.
My pleasure. Good discussion.